Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson. One narrative that's repeated in ways both large and small on a daily basis in our culture, especially the United States, is that an individual has no power. Corporations and the state have all the power. And that's reflected in everything from Supreme Court decisions or to the overt militarization of local police forces, you name it. So what is any one person to do if they feel deep within their gut or their heart that something really ought to be done about all of this? Well, today I bring you a story of direct activism and resistance by an individual that not only made a difference, but continues to make a difference. On December 10th, 1997, a 23-year-old woman named Julia Butterfly Hill ascended to the top of a 180-foot, 1,500-year-old redwood tree in California that was slated to be cut down by the Pacific Lumber Company. Just over 2 years later, she climbed down from that tree. And that tree and 3 surrounding acres have been saved from clear cutting, but the larger victory was in the message of hope and empowerment that sprang from her resistance. Quite luckily, she's come to my town for an event, and even more fortunately, she's been staying in our guest room, so I've had the chance to meet her. Welcome, Julia. It's a real pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So, how in the world did you end up in a tree?
It's so interesting because I can look back at every step in my life led me to the tree. Mm-hmm. And it's so great for me now to see that because I realize that everything in our life can serve us in whatever commitments that we have. Even things that we think might be wrong or bad can actually serve us. I was raised with a traveling preacher for a father. We lived in a 31-foot camping trailer with 5 people, extremely poor, 2 brothers, no sisters, played outside a lot. And that was my playground. So I was raised to appreciate nature, but with a very strict religious father, I was more taught that we're here to worship the creator, not the creation. Mm-hmm. And yet, every time I was out in nature is when I would feel the most sense of sacred, much, much deeper than when I was in church. So, that was my upbringing, raised really poor, went into college and majored in business because I didn't want to deal with the shame that I dealt with being raised poor in America. And I was very successful in business. And then in 1996, I had a car wreck. I was hit by a drunk driver. And the steering wheel of the car went into my skull. And I lost my short-term memory and a huge amount of my motor skills. And it took almost a year of very intensive physical and cognitive therapy to recover from that wreck. And during that wreck, I started looking at what is the difference between real value and perceived value. Because I'd been made to feel ashamed as a poor child growing up. And then I was like the all-American success story, hard work, raised myself up by my bootstraps and made something of myself. Like, we love that story, especially in America, United States of America. But then after the wreck, I actually stuttered when I talked because my short-term memory was so damaged, I would forget what I was saying while I was saying it. So all of a sudden I went from being a drain upon society to a success story to being a drain upon society again. Mm-hmm. And yet who I was as a person hadn't changed. I mean, of course I changed some as I grew up, but like at my core, I was still Julia. Yet in society's eyes, I was changing according to how much I could produce, really. And that made me go, well, there's a difference between real value and perceived value. And we have a society that's based on perceived value. And after going through a very intense experience like that, I realized I wanted to go find something of real value. What's a deeper purpose for me to be here? And that's what started me on a journey that eventually led me to the Redwoods.
So this search for real value, you found something that called you. So take us to the moment, like how did you end up? There must have been a moment when you were harnessing up and there was equipment involved and it's probably dark out and there's a little edginess to the whole thing. Somehow take us at that moment, like how did you experience, like when you started going up that tree, what were you feeling and did you have any idea you'd be up there for more than 2 years?
Thank goodness I didn't know what was coming. I tell people if I'd seen what was coming, I would have laughed, and then I would have screamed, and then I would have run back down the mountain. And luckily, life doesn't do that to us. We're just, even when we feel like we're being completely overwhelmed with something, which I have now experienced many times in my life, what my life has taught me is that even if something's overwhelming, it can actually serve our capacity to grow and to do even greater things, even if at first it feels like it's insurmountable. And oftentimes our largest obstacle is what's in our mind, not the external obstacles. And yes, external obstacles are very real, and we do have to deal with them. The current structures and paradigms that we live in that are highly destructive, they are very real obstacles that we have to face. And at the same time, the greatest difference comes with how we then think about and respond to whatever obstacle shows up. So luckily, I didn't see what was coming, because I only planned on being there for 2 to 3 weeks to a month max, and then it turned into 2 years and 8 days. So my mind was prepared for 2 weeks to a month. I ended up climbing up in the worst winter in recorded history of California. I ended up going through the company trying to kill me. I ended up going through sleep deprivation because the company actually surrounded me with security guards and floodlights and cut off my supplies for 10 days to try and starve me down. And then 2 days into it, started blowing very, very loud air horns about every 15 minutes. So I couldn't sleep all through the night and the day. So for 8 days, I didn't sleep and had to bear witness to beautiful forests being destroyed, and that was breaking my heart. And in our normal life, when something happens that we don't like or that we're uncomfortable with, we go shopping, we go out to eat, we go drink with friends, we go to the movies, we turn on the television. We have all these ways of shutting down and numbing to things that hurt us, but I couldn't do that. So even that was something that nearly took me down. And that moment where I was hooking up to the tree for the first time, it was actually my very first time I'd ever climbed that way. It was some
with
of
the
the way rock
ascenders,
climbers. Yeah, well, we didn't even have ascenders. We didn't have the money for that. We used Prussic knots.
Okay.
Yeah.
Old school.
Old school. I tell people I now have a deeper affinity with an inchworm. Because that's really what you do. You just kind of inch your way up. But I had no formal training. It was at the base of the tree. They said, this is a Prussic knot. This is how you tie it. This is how you move it. That's how you climb. It took like 10 minutes. That was my training. Wow. So about 75 feet off the ground, I made the mistake. They say, don't look down. And I made the mistake, and I looked down, and I whoa! And so I just closed my eyes and put my forehead right up against Luna, the tree, and just allowed myself to become one with the tree. And I felt my energy like going down the trunk all the way down into the roots, and it helped ground me. And then I just stayed focused on that trunk all the way up. So people all the time say, well, were you afraid of heights? I'm like, yeah, in the beginning. I didn't know I was. 75 feet off the ground, dangling from a rope the size of my thumb by ropes, the width of a pencil. I had a moment of, oh my God, what am I doing? And then I had more than one moment like that afterwards. But I have found in my life that if we choose to care enough about something, our care will access our courage, and our courage will give us access to do things that our mind would otherwise say is not possible.
Or that we won't do. Now, let's talk about direct action. This is fairly direct. Why take that route? Were other avenues closed off at that point in time? By the time we're seeing direct action, I mean, it feels desperate in some way.
Well, it's a valid point. I mean, people don't risk their freedom or their life as the first option. So direct action is never the first option. Right. Whenever we see direct action happening, what we're actually seeing is that all other systems are failing. We see that governments are failing in their responsibility to uphold and protect the public trust. Corporations are failing in their responsibility to make sure that they're producing goods and services that do actually benefit society in a very real way, not benefit some at the expense of others. And consumers are failing in their responsibility to pay attention to their choices and what are they buying and who and what is being impacted by what they buy and what they do with it afterwards. So yes, direct action, whenever we see it anywhere, no matter if we say, oh, that person's a radical, what they're actually showing us is how radically out of balance our world is, that someone would feel forced to risk their freedom and potentially their life because something is so deeply out of balance.
I just, as an aside, a framing I've held for a long time, that my country's trying to convince me that terrorism is this very real thing that exists on a daily basis. And my experience in understanding the world is, it's by the time you see terrorism, it means that the so-called terrorist has no other recourse.
Right.
That is the last act of somebody who has no other hope, no other avenues. It's cornered animal stage. And so much of what I see going on in our larger world is requiring us to get into sort of cornered animal stage. If you don't, there are many things that when they get wiped out, they're gone. But by any humanly useful time frame, right? If we take an aquifer that takes 10,000 years to recharge and suck it dry, it's gone. And so in your case, you were looking at a grove of trees that Pacific Lumber Company owned, and they were just clear cutting.
Well, the deeper issue was that 97% of our original redwoods are gone. And that 97% mostly has been logged in the last 100 years. So the logging began 150 years ago, but 100 years ago, the technology advanced in such a way that the capacity to cut them down became at light speed. And so we're talking about trees that are 2,000 to 3,000 years old. 97% of them gone in 100 years. We can't get that back. And the fact that they're still logging only 3% left. The fact that they're cutting on very steep hillsides that cause mudslides, that destroy habitat for critical and endangered species, and also destroy people's very homes and lives and livelihood. The fact that they go in after they clear cut them, they light the clear cuts on fire with diesel fuel or with napalm. And forests are more than just trees. They're plants and animals and microorganisms in the soil. When you dump that much toxicity onto a piece of land, there's no microorganisms in the soil left. Like the entire ecosystem is destroyed. And that's what really spurred me into wanting to do something. It was so interesting when I was in the tree and debating the PR people for Maxam Corporation-owned Pacific Lumber. They love to say, for those radical activists, enough is never enough. And I was like, you guys got 97%. When is enough for you, right? I'm like, we're asking for 3%. We're not even asking for 33%. We're asking for 3%. When is enough for you? And that's why we're forced to take to the trees, not only to try and protect little scraps of them, but more to try and get it out into the mainstream consciousness that an issue that's quite dire is actually happening. Like when 97% of something is gone, it's on the verge of being gone forever. And we don't have the capacity, even with all of our scientific knowledge, we don't even have the capacity to scratch the surface of the consequences of our actions that are causing this mass extinction. We're starting to see the consequences, but we're causing such a major imbalance that we're just getting a tiny, tiny view into the real impact, the domino effect of wiping out species and destroying ecosystems and pretending as if that doesn't have any impact on us.
Indeed. Now, there was something about your actions. There have been a lot of actions. I mean, people have put themselves in harm's way. People have died. Greenpeace takes very aggressive action a lot, but something about your efforts captured the imagination. We see that reflected all over the place, right? So you have a song written about you by Fish. You're on the lyrics of some Red Hot Chili Peppers tunes. You were on Penn and Teller. There's a Simpsons episode, which I believe is Lisa the Tree Hugger, right?
Right. I really do love that Simpsons episode. My friends videotaped it and showed it to me, and I don't know how long it's been since I laughed that hard. It was so funny. And it really did. The story made it into popular culture, not only in the United States, but all over the world.
All over the world. Why was that?
I mean, it's hard to tell. First of all, I have to acknowledge that there was a movement of tree sitting before me. So I didn't just come into a zone of nothing. Like, I do believe that the garden had been prepared for my action to flourish. That if I had done it 20 years earlier or 20 years later, I don't really know. the results. And I'm clear, though, that because a movement had been working and building and working and building, that was a part of the success. I believe part of the success is most people remember a childhood moment where they had a tree fort or wanted one. So it taps into that part of us. And also, I think that there's something about the hero's journey, too, that I really do see so much in people, this desire to have something worthy of giving our lives to. Because we give our lives to so much that really isn't worthy of it. Mm-hmm. And I think even if people aren't completely conscious of that, their spirits, their hearts, their souls feel it. And that's why we turn to self-medicating and numbing ourselves with shopping and overconsumption and movies and television and drugs and alcohol and all these things that we do, because there's something deep within us, even if we don't recognize it and can name it, that wants to have something worth giving our lives to. So there's something powerful about that arc of what takes ordinary and makes it become extraordinary. And I tell people the only thing extraordinary means is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary people are ordinary people who come up against something that calls out their greatness, and they choose to say yes to that calling, even if they don't know where it's going to lead them or how it's going to end, that they can't choose to walk away. I call it the choiceless choice, that we could choose to not say anything. We could choose to walk away, but to do that would kill off a piece of ourselves. So even though we could say no, we have to say yes. And there's something about having something deeply meaningful to say yes to give our lives to. The final thing that I think also resonated for people is there are so many people who care deeply about this planet, its beauty. I mean, that's part of the discussion. Like, let's set aside even science and environment or jobs or anything. Like, pretty much we live on this absolutely jaw-droppingly beautiful planet, and everything that's unsustainable is also really ugly. Mm-hmm. So even from an artist's view, it's like, you can't argue that the tar sands extraction in Canada is pretty, right? Like, I don't know a single person who go like, oh, that's nice. And you see a beautiful ancient forest and then it looks like a bomb's been dropped off in it. There's no one who can say that's pretty. So there's this movement of people, regardless of exactly our view and our bent on economics, science, policy, whatever, that appreciates beauty and wants to see that beauty protected and recognizes the value of living in a healthy planet and on a beautiful planet. And our voices aren't heard in the mainstream. And I feel like my action in many ways became the voice for the voiceless all over the world, because it did make it into the mainstream conversation.
This concept of living with beauty is important to me because I have a judgment that is something we've lost, right? So when I look at old architecture, mm-hmm. which I'm defining as at least 200 years old, but when I go to Paris, say, people built extraordinary things with an eye for the beauty of it, right? Mm-hmm. At a time when they didn't have good, solid steel to work with necessarily, you know, and oil to help the thing along, just with muscle labor and fairly crude implements, fashioning these extraordinarily beautiful things. And so some of my most spiritual moments have been in places like Yosemite, you know, and it's easy for me to appreciate Yosemite because it's on a scale that I'm a human kind of grabs me, you know, awe-inspiring, but not so overwhelming like the Grand Canyon, you know? But if I shrank down a little bit, the complexity and the beauty that exists in an old mycorrhizal formation in a subsoil of a old growth forest is extraordinary. Yes. What little I know about it, you know. And being in the presence of old growth trees is really powerful for me, and I think it is for almost everybody. And the idea that we're turning that into fence boards, be like taking Yosemite and turning it into gravel, you know, for driveways in the next subdivision in Las Vegas. Right. I think we would consider that some sort of a crime, but a crime you're suggesting against something that's really deep within us, which is that we're here to live around beauty and we're destroying that beauty, and we're not actually even having a conversation about that. Right. It gets chunked into radical versus progress. Is that the argument? And it's not even the debate we should be having, is it?
For me, it's not. I mean, it's a crisis for me. It's a spiritual crisis. Mm-hmm. It's a lack. It's a lack of depth of understanding. It is a crisis. It is like this loss of beauty. I mean, it's just like, I think sometimes we make it too complicated. You know, like when you break it down to its most core elements, it's actually not that complicated. Yeah. And I think part of our challenge in making a difference in the world today is how to get through all the noise of complication and return back to the beauty of simplicity.
Mm. And that's what I think that's part of what you inspired in people, was seeing that. And it was worldwide. And so the tree you were sitting in, named Luna, is still there. Last I checked online, right? It's still there, and a few acres around it, right? Yeah. So, but the real victory was the fact that since then, it's been 14 years since, people still want to know about this story, and they're still talking to you, and you're still able to reach people and communicate with them about these topics.
It's been phenomenal, including in ways I never would have imagined, and it also reminds me, and I share the message constantly, that we can't know the ripples of our actions, positive or negative. Because I've had people come up to me, like a woman that shortly after I came down from Luna, actually, who had been diagnosed with cancer and told that she had 6 months max to live and she needed to get her life in order. And I don't remember the exact form of cancer, but she was you got 6 months, you better get your life in order. And so when the doctors told her she was going to die, she began dying. And she happened to live in one of the areas where I was on the radio all the time and going through what turned out to be the worst winter in recorded history of California and a company trying to kill me and all these different things. And I was just sharing authentically, which is how I do everything, about my journey, my experience, what I was learning, what was horrifying, what was beautiful, everything. And she came to me at this event, I guess about 6 months to a year after I came down. And she said, the doctors told me I was going to die, and so I started dying. And then I heard your voice on the radio, and I listened to you and what you were going through and how you transformed your reaction to your experience. And one day I realized if you could do that, then I had the potential to change the death sentence the doctor had given me. And this was over 2 years after she had been told you have 6 months to live, and she was in remission. Mm. And you don't think going to live in a tree for 2 years is going to cause that impact. If it's true there, how much is it true in our lives that maybe even something as simple as smiling at a stranger on the corner could change their life? We don't know. And somehow this story continues to live on because it speaks to something deep within us that, whether we like it or not, and I think sometimes we don't, we are all connected. And that connection is profound. That connection is vital. And us remembering that connection is deeply interwoven with whether we get to continue on this planet as a species or not. Hmm.
I started this podcast with this idea that I think is marketed well in this country, that a person has no power, can't really make a difference. Is that true?
It's so funny that you asked that question. Because so many times people come up to me and say two things. Number one, thank you, Julia, for doing that action. I never could have done it. Yeah. And I remind people, well, neither could have I. On December 10th, 1997, I was not the girl who is the woman I am today. Like, in my mind, that wasn't doable. So when people tell me I never could have done that, I'm like, yes, and neither could have I. And so therefore, how often do you hold yourself back because you think you can't do something versus trying it out anyway? Mm-hmm. And then number two, people always come up to me and say, thank you, Julia, for showing us that one person can make the difference. And I started thinking about it, and I realized, because no choice happens in a vacuum, it's not only spiritually impossible, it is scientifically impossible to make no difference. And we need to deeply get that. It is actually impossible as a person on the planet today to make no difference, to have no impact. And so the question, can I make a difference? It's a myth. It's a lie. It perpetuates the disease of disconnect. It makes sure that we're good consumers. It makes sure that we feel disempowered. When we get that every single choice makes a difference, because it's impossible to make no difference. We actually realize that 7 billion of us and growing are activists. We're all actively changing the world, even if we don't see the impact of that choice. And so the question stops being, can one person make a difference? And the question then becomes, okay, I do make a difference. What kind of a difference do I want to make with the gift of my life? What am I committed to seeing in the world, and how can I have my life be a contribution to that? So it's not, can I make a difference? It's, I do make a difference. And we need to deeply, deeply, deeply get that. Unfortunately, in privileged societies, we're so disconnected from the impact of our choices. And one of the examples I started using years ago that thankfully is now finally making it into the cultural conversation is when you say you're going to throw something away, where's away? And the fact that we have that word proves how disconnected we've become. Because away is a place, and it's here. It might not be right in our backyard, but we all might have different houses. We share one home. There's no such thing as away. Away has people attached to it, has places attached to it, has animals attached to it. The fact that we think there isn't a way is the magnifying glass into how little we realize how much of a difference we truly make.
I had an experience with that when I was driving a gentleman a while back. He was from Switzerland, and he was laughing at these houses that were going up in the subdivision. And he didn't have perfect English. He said, why do you build out of cardboard? Because they were being made out of this pressboard stuff.
Right, totally.
But his thought was he was just shocked by it because he could see that they were going to have to be torn down at some point.
Right.
In Switzerland, there's no way because they don't allow, if you have construction debris from a project in your house, you have to keep it in your yard. There is no place to put it. They don't have a dump it can go to. So people think very differently about purchases. They don't, when they buy something, they're like, I'm going to have to get rid of this at some point.
Right.
So is it fully recyclable? And if not, I don't want it. But B, is it going to last a long time? But C, they're not going to just willy-nilly throw some cardboard houses up because what would they do with the resulting mess afterwards, right? So it has this whole different mindset, we do have this disposable mindset, but all you have to do is take your little fingers, go to Google and look at the plastic in the Pacific Ocean and the destructive effects it's having on the megafauna, but we're now discovering the microfauna too, who are ingesting that plastic. And so there's no more away. And that means that everybody listening to this, myself, yourself, everybody, has an impact with every act of consumption, every act of disposal. Those are all actions.
Yes.
Every person does make a difference.
Not only that, but my experience has also told me we need to be mindful of how our words make a difference, and so do our thoughts. That I want to get to the core of everything. It's like when you talk about getting to the heart of the matter. It's like I want to get to the heart of the matter. Yeah. And actions are led by thought. So not only are actions powerful, what we say can kill off something or bring life to something or someone. The thoughts that we choose to think either give life to what we are for or give energy to what we're against. It is all, even the subtle thoughts, make a difference.
It's interesting. I consider that in the United States, one of the things we're sold on a daily basis most persistently is fear.
Yes.
That's our number one internal consumption product.
Right.
And since we center around fear, we get a lot of fear. And I run into people all the time who carry a lot of fear and anxiety when statistically they're worrying about stuff that has absolutely no impact on their lives, no meaning, none whatsoever. And so what you're saying is because we choose to sell that fear and people willingly eat that fear, that what we end up with is fear. We get to stew in it. And it's a choice, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, because honestly, even if we're afraid or anxious over something that is going to impact our life, what difference is the fear and anxiousness going to make? It just makes us more fearful and more anxious.
Right.
It actually contributes to the problem. It doesn't actually make anything any better.
Yeah.
I talked to you about how, like, every so often the way life works, it's like, okay, sooner or later, life might pick up a shovel and knock you upside the head with it. That's just life. When we get resentful, fearful, anxious, it's like picking up the shovel and hitting ourselves back in the head with it. It doesn't actually pick up the shovel and use it for something constructive.
Yeah.
It just knocks us back in the head with it. Whereas if we can shift our thoughts, we can maybe take that shovel and do something constructive with it. Mm-hmm. So it's, yes, fear, anxiety, apathy, cynicism, grief, rage, overwhelm, sadness. This is all just part of the human journey. But our awareness of what we're thinking and why, and how long we're thinking any particular thing, actually makes a very real difference. To be awake in the world today means you're going to have some intense feelings. The only way you're not having intense feelings is if you're shut down, if you're frozen up through whatever way.
Psychopath?
Yes. Yes. Which, is just there. Even a psychopath is the natural product of the dripping of toxins into our environment. It's like we say we have a legal amount of toxins, like X parts per million. And I'm like, where do we get to the point where we accept that something has a skull and a crossbones on the container is okay? Like, I'm still wrestling with that one. I'm like, there's just nothing about that seems like it's okay. But if it's true, like we're now seeing that, after years and years and years of study, polar bears are showing up with both genitalia, which never occurred before. And they're realizing it's because of things like pesticides and chemicals moving up the food chain and becoming more and more condensed because toxins store in fatty tissue. So the toxins go into the water, go into the fish. The seal eats the fish. A little bit of toxin goes in the seal. Eats another fish with a little bit of toxin. It goes in. The polar bear gets the seal. It builds up until after generations of this toxic buildup, even though we say it will distill, you distill alcohol, it gets stronger. You distill a tincture, it gets stronger. It doesn't get weaker. So if it's true for the physical world, it's also true for the mental, emotional, spiritual world. So I feel that if you look at it, like even a psychopath, as we might call it, is the natural automatic responder to a huge amount of toxins in our physical, mental, emotional environment passed down from generation to generation. It's not just some little blip. It's an indicator. So to be awake, you're going to have these feelings unless you're shut down or unless you're the product of the toxins in our environment in some way. And then we have to feel those feelings, and now what? What I know from my life anyway was that choosing to shut down caused me a deeper sense of grief than choosing to be awake and experience the grief that goes along with it. There was something about selling out on my soul and having my life have so little meaning that I would rather have a deeper purpose to my life to give my life to and deal with the grief and the rage and all the things that come with it than to be a part of the Walking Dead, which is what I was doing for a long time. Like, my body was here, but I was not.
This is a really important topic that comes up a lot in my listener base, which is you wake up, there's a little belief shaking going on there. Typical range of emotions tends to follow that, right? Come out of denial, a little anger, a little bargaining, a little depression, maybe some form of surrender or acceptance, depending on what we want to call it. And you can repeat that cycle over and over again. But there comes a point where it's almost like riding point on the Humvee in Iraq for too many days in a row. It becomes heavy.
Right.
And it's hard to remain alert to all of these insults, in part because they're exponentially increasing. Right? There's no fight the battle and take 2 years off kind of a moment anymore, right? There's a shock doctrine out there, which is just, you got to pick which battle you want to fight, and then good luck, because there's 1,000 more raging all around you. First, do you see that in your travels and all the people you talk to, and in yourself? How do we manage the weight of that, the grief that comes with attending to the world?
I see it all the time in myself and in others. And the first thing we have to realize is that our technology and our access to information has grown exponentially, and our nervous system, our energy bodies, our biology actually hasn't evolved at the same rate. And we need to really get that, because what that means is there is such a thing as TMI. Right?
Too much
It's information.
Too much information.
There actually is such a thing. And the image I use is like, if you take a sponge and you soak it in dirty, might be soapy water, but dirty soapy water, and then you try and clean your counters with it. You know, you shouldn't be shocked when you just shove dirty soapy water and get kind of smudged up countertops. Like, they're not going to become sparkling clean. Any reasonable person would get that. But we are sponges too. And so if we fill up with too much of what's wrong, there's less capacity to hold what's right. And then we try and create clarity in our lives and in the world. It's not going to work. It's just not. So we do have to be careful. Even with important podcasts like yours, like, we have to be careful of how much we're taking in, how much we're taking in of the problem, and then how much we take in of the potentials of solution as well, and try and find that balance. I'm not advocating that we stick our head in the sand and be, Pollyannas. Oh, everything's fine. Like, that's not what I'm advocating for. But I am clear that not only with information, but also with just energy, and the same technology that allows your and my voice to now reach around the world is also the same technology that causes our nervous system to vibrate at a much, much higher pace. So what we then have to do is, how do we balance living in this time, in this world, getting the information we need while not getting too much information? And one of the things that I advocate is, it's very, very important to go out and take time to slow down and be in the other than human constructed world. And I do understand it's a privilege that not everyone has to go walking in the forest, but even if all you have is a city park, going and sitting with a tree and being with that tree on a regular basis and slowing down and noticing over time that even the chaos of sirens and alarms and cars honking, if we be with one spot over and over and over again, our rhythm tends to slow down with its rhythm, and it helps us, our very real biology, find a little bit of center in the chaos. It's very, very important. Another thing that's important is to recognize the bodies that we've been given is our tool, it is our vessel. And just like a car is not going to run as well if we put junk in it and don't clean its lines and everything and change the hoses and the belts when necessary. The same thing with the machine of our body. What we put into it actually has a direct impact on everything, including our emotions and our capacity to handle intensity. And sadly, when we're in intense moments, we tend to go towards addictive behavior. So we'll tend to eat more sugary things, more fatty things, more junk food. The very same thing that actually it feels good in the short term. It helps us feel better in the moment, but then it makes us feel worse later on. So for long term, dealing with grief, overwhelm, anxiety, fear, recognizing that what we put in the machine of our bodies does have a direct, even if we're not aware of it, direct impact to how we can process the intensity of our world. Another thing that's important for me is getting outside all the stuff that's inside. So I have friends that I actually call, and the code is, do you have a moment? And what that means is, I actually need to just vent and not be fixed. I need to be safe and free to be completely unedited, completely incorrect on every possible level. And if they're busy or they don't have the emotional bandwidth to hold that space, they tell me, and I just go find another friend. But it's so helpful for me, again, going back to our biology and our physiology, that our nervous system, animals in the wild, after they're threatened in some way, if you watch them, they shake. Dogs will shake their whole body. A bird will flap its feathers. When you watch animals, and we are animals, when you watch animals in nature, when their nervous system is upset, they find a way to release the energy. And that's part of how they can handle the intensity. Well, we don't do that in healthy ways, then we do it in unhealthy ways, because the energy has to go somewhere. So for me, it helps to I don't want to be fixed. I don't want to be told it's all going to be okay. I don't want to, just think loving thoughts. It just makes me want to punch you. I just need to get that charge out of my system. And I find sometimes that when I do that, in an intensity of a moment, I'm less likely to be taken down as hard because I've wrung the sponge out a little bit.
Now, this is really a central issue to my listeners, is this idea of being very alone with this information. Because it's still not, let's be honest, it's not at all remotely polite to talk about real stuff
Right.
that's going on, right? And there's plenty of things that if you're just mildly curious and a little bit of alert is going on in your awareness, you can say, what I'm being told by my culture and what's actually happening are not even remotely lining up here, right? And there's all kinds of craziness out there. So for people who get that the world is like, it's literally, I think our culture is like, it's just a veneer, right? For the most part. And you either believe in the veneer wholeheartedly or you're over here in this sort of marginalized zone. Mm-hmm. People feel alone with this stuff. So I think there's something really important to having a network of people you can just say what's actually truly on your mind. This is what we do when we hold seminars, is that honestly, when Beck and Adam and I hold a seminar, I honestly think we could just bring the assembled 50, 60 people together and just do nothing all weekend. And it would still be magic.
Right.
Because they would have this opportunity to actually talk freely.
Right.
Not necessarily to vent even, but just to freely let flow what they're actually thinking.
Right.
Which is very heavily edited, stifled, censored otherwise.
Yes. I tell people, since this whole conversation about global climate change started really coming super to the forefront in a lot of people's conversation, I started saying, the silver lining in this storm cloud is that the kind of crisis we're facing, peak oil and global climate change and all these things, the solution mandates localization. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mandate bigger. Like, we've been trying the bigger, better, faster now. We kind of see the results of that process. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to solve the crisis created by bigger, faster now with more bigger, faster now, which is what people keep trying to do. The gift hidden in the collapse and the crisis is that it actually is going to mandate localization. Now, with the technologies we have today, we can build friendships and alliances with like-minded individuals all over the world if we are someone who feels alone in our community. And at the same time, I tell people, we need to turn off our televisions and go out into our communities and tell a vision. And that's not, this is what's wrong with the world, and that's what's wrong with the world, and this is what's wrong. Like, there's no vision in what's wrong. Right. Martin Luther King wrote so many phenomenal speeches, and the most famous one is I Have a Dream. Yeah. And he spoke a dream whose time had come. He spoke a dream that spoke to the heart and souls and minds of so many people that it compelled a shift in our world and made a huge difference, because the dream was big enough and ripe enough to demand that change. So it is also important that if we don't feel we have that community, that we actually prioritize creating that. That it's not only healthy for ourselves, it's actually what our world is going to need as all this unsustainable structure begins to crumble. Mm-hmm. Because it is unsustainable. That means it has to end. Yep. At some point. That's what unsustainable means. That we want to start creating the solutions before the collapse, not just wait until afterwards, because it's easier to do it before the collapse, number one. And number two, if we start building what it is we want now, as the collapse comes, it can create compost instead of it just being a big mess. So I do encourage people too, if they do feel alone, to find those networks of support, actually prioritize that as part of the work. Mm-hmm. And it seems so nuanced. Yes, but our world is on fire. Yes, and there's only so much you can do to put out a fire as one person. Whereas if you're one person who's got good gear that you've maintained, that you've taken care of, you take the time to put the mask on and the outfit on, and you go in with your buddies, you're more likely to stop the fire.
Well, indeed. And I've had to take a number of journeys to understand how to be more effective at communicating. And the way I measure success is if somebody's taken action or something has shifted. Right? That's how I measure success in personal work. Right? So my own assessment is that I've seen a lot of people spend a lot of time in talk therapy, decades, with no shift. So I judge it unsuccessful. I've seen people spend 5 minutes in other modalities and have profound transformations. So I say that works. We know something from behavioral economics that one of the key things that's important, marketers know this, that if you want people to take action, they have to have a sense of agency in the story. They have to have control. And if they don't have that control, they won't take action. They won't buy your product. They won't shift their belief structure. They won't something. And ultimately, that's what I see is marketed heavily in the American narrative right now, is that I'm pointing at you, I could point at myself, have no agency, right? Meaning this is all completely out of your control. There's nothing that you can do about this, is really what the message is. But the truth is that we're making every dollar we spend as a vote for or against something. Every action we take, every time we throw something away or not, every decision we make is really important. And the thing I fight the most, and I don't really allow it to spread on my website at all, is when we get into, people will raise the victim story, because I found that the victim mode is heavily depolarizing, de-energizing, leads to no action.
Right.
Because if there's a perpetrator and a victim, you're off the hook.
Right.
It's a very powerless place to be. And there is a lot of room to feel like this is an us and a them and a perpetrator and a victim and all of that. But you're saying we don't have the luxury of existing in that frame of mind.
Well, for me, not only do we not have the luxury, it's a miserable way to live.
Yeah. So let's start with that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's enough.
No, just get to the heart of the matter. It's just a miserable way to live, and life is too short to spend it miserable all the time. I tell people all the time, the quickest way to die is get born. It's a fast track.
Yeah, it's a guarantee.
Yeah, sooner or later we're all hitting that dead point if we're born. So we don't get to choose birth or death. We get to choose in between. Mm-hmm. And yes, you can choose victim if that's what feels right to you. You've been wronged and somebody else wronged you. That is a valid point. But it's a pretty miserable way to view life. And I would much rather, even if I in a moment feel wronged, I would much rather get out of the miserable downward spiral that comes with staying attached to victim mode. I never resonated with the everything happens for a reason statement, that especially because I experienced a lot of violence to me growing up, and it felt actually really hurtful to me for people to say, well, everything happens for a reason. And what I came to in my life was, no, everything happens, and then the reason is what we make of it. As far as we know, we're the only species who make reason. So, something happened to me. And then I can choose to become empowered or disempowered as a result. But it doesn't mean that thing happened to make me stronger, right? Like getting beaten up as a kid. There was no reason for that. It's just kids are mean sometimes and they beat you up. That's just what happened. But I can choose to be disempowered and be the victim and be like, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't deserve it. They beat me up because I was poor. That's terrible. I could have that story, and within 5 minutes, I'd be sobbing and miserable and hate life. Or I could be like, wow, that was kind of a crappy thing they did to me. And I'm just going to choose to be more thoughtful and compassionate as a result. I feel a lot better with that second conversation.
Well, speaking of between here and there, what's next for you?
I'm at this amazing space in my life of the great unknown. And one of, I think, the things that challenges people is they get freaked out by the unknown.
Yes.
And so we will stay on the sinking ship because at least it's comfortable.
I know this ship.
We know this ship. If I jump off this ship, I might drown or get eaten by sharks. Well, if you stay on the ship, you're going down. So take your pick. So it's amazing how often as a human family, we stay attached to really destructive behaviors and patterns in our lives. And even if it's just destroying our heart and soul, like if we're doing something that's just not in alignment with what we really want to be doing, it's not awful, it's not terrible, but it's not really feeding our passion. It's not feeding our purpose. It's not feeding what we're really committed to. Even if it's just a slow leak, it leaks our energy, it leaks our joy, it leaks our sense of peace and power. And we will oftentimes stay in a leaky, sinking ship versus jump and trust. So for me, I've just really reached this place in my life where I get excited by the unknown. And I remind people, like, a magician is a magician because we don't understand how they do what they do. Mm-hmm. Which means magic and mystery can only happen in the space of the unknown. Magic and mystery doesn't happen on charts or graphs or business plans. Mm-hmm. Magic and mystery only happens in the place of the unknown. And I love being in a space of awe and wonder and reverence. I love being in that space of magic and mystery. So occasionally in my life, that means I have to jump into the great unknown. And right now my life is another one of those jumps. I'm completing the cycle of my life of being Julia Butterfly Hill on tour. And I'm going to focus on my health for a little while because my health has been deeply impacted by many things, including touring. And just know that I'm not going to try and figure out now what's next, because there's no magic or mystery in that. I'm actually ready to invite in the unknown again. So I'm just going to stand in this place of taking care of the personal ecology so I can bring that back up, so that when I reemerge the butterfly through the cocoon process, that I'll be even more healthy to take on whatever is calling me and is alive for me then. So it's a very exciting time for me right now.
Fantastic. I can't wait to see what the mystery brings you. Maybe some other magic will strike, or it'll be something completely different. Who knows?
Yeah.
And I'll know that I've made it when I get my own Simpson episode at some point.
I'm telling you, we gotta, like, all of your listeners, they need to do a letter writing campaign and be like, we want a Simpsons episode. What would the episode be on? Like, what would be your... If they were to do a Simpsons episode on you, what would that be about? What would it look like?
It would be Bart opens his own fractional reserve bank and runs it just completely as is, and people will think, what a parody this must be. But he could just run it like banks actually run, and nobody will believe it.
Okay, your listeners have now heard. Time to start the letter writing campaign. Come on, Simpsons!
Oh, well, thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous with it, and I really enjoyed meeting you.
Thank you. Likewise. Really appreciate it. And it is teamwork, too. You know, like, we all have a unique place on the team. And when you were just saying thank you, that was the last piece that just came present to me to remind us that we're not all meant to do the same thing. We're all meant to do what is ours to do and to bring that to the team. So thank you for doing what is yours to do on this team, and for creating a space for me to bring forth part of what I do. And that's how we work towards this vision we have for the world.
All right, shake on it. All right.
We just shook.
Because we're all on a team, and it takes a lot of teachers and everybody bringing their gifts. And I have a lot of gratitude that I was found the courage and had the support to bring my gifts into the world. And I'm very good at what I do, and that I can do this at this point in time is actually really, really special. I think that this next period of time is there's a lot to be fearful about on one side of the coin, but on the other side, it's destruction and rebirth. And it's interesting to see and be part of, like, what's that rebirth process? What is that? What's that regeneration going to be? How do I play in that? Knowing that this book is going to be written for a very, very, very long time after I'm gone.
Right.
So just going to have fun with what I'm doing while I'm here.
And hopefully have a Simpsons episode.
Indeed. All right, Julia, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.